Hey, LinkedIn. Welcome to this week's LinkedIn Live with my guest, Joanna Parsons. Quick note on technology. So I don't know, for some reason, this event was showing up on LinkedIn at 3 p.m., even though all of the details said 2 p.m. And when we tried to click in, it wasn't allowing us because it said that the event was scheduled for 3 p.m. But then I clicked in again, it said 2 p.m. So welcome, Joanna. Few technical issues, but no worries at all. It looks like we're live on LinkedIn already. So we're here today to talk about one of the recent episodes that came out on the Happy at Work podcast. It was a few weeks ago now at this stage, but one of the more popular episodes. Joanna is an expert in internal communications. Do you want to give kind of a brief intro as to kind of who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. My name is Joanna Parsons. I live in Dublin. I am a remote work enthusiast. So I am in my home office here. There's usually a cat over there. This is where I work every day. So I have worked in internal communication for more than 10 years. I absolutely love it. So that is what I do for my job. I also teach a class in strategic internal communication. I run my own website and newsletter on internal communication, and I sit on the board of directors with the Institute of Internal Communication as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think we touched on this at the start of the podcast, but I didn't really get the role of internal communications, didn't really get what it was, the strategic importance of what it is actually about. And we'll maybe get onto that in a second. And I wanted to say, for anyone who's listening today who works in that, because I know, Joanna, you're connected with loads of people, and there was a good few people who said they were coming along today. So either live or watching the replay. No offense, I just didn't know that it was a thing, because I think in some of the organizations I worked in previously, it wasn't explicitly shared that was a role. Or maybe I think there was one company that I can think of that I worked in previously where there may have been a standalone role, which was internal communications. Again, didn't fully grasp the kind of the nature of what it was. Do you want to explain a little bit about internal communications, maybe the strategic importance of what it actually is?
Yeah, well, you're not alone. Like, if I was to meet somebody that's not in this industry and I say I work in internal communication, like, people really don't know what that is. And then you explain that it's, a role inside an organization where you're not communicating with external stakeholders. I'm not dealing with the media, but my communications role is solely within the organization. And the purpose is really to create a shared understanding amongst employees of what they need to do to deliver on the company strategy. So, like, a starting point for that is where organizations often fall down. They don't do a great job of communicating what that strategy is, let alone telling people what they can do to help achieve that. So there was a lot of investment in internal communication during COVID, because organizations suddenly went, oh God, we're not all together. We can't just pull everyone into the meeting room and give an update. We have to actually take maybe a more intentional approach, and this is really important. So there's been a lot of uptake in it. It's getting more kind of mainstream now, that a lot of organizations are like, okay, this isn't a nice to have, this is critical need to have for business.
Yeah.
But it's great to be having this conversation, to be able to explain what it is. And maybe for some people watching who maybe don't have an internal comms team yet, might be going, oh yeah, we need that.
Yeah. And maybe people don't realize what the missing piece is. They're like, and, I think one of the examples that you shared was, the CEO puts together this fantastic strategy document that's 60 something pages long. And then he pops his head into the team meetings to ask, well, how are you getting on? What do you think about the strategy that I put together? And no one's read it because it's 60 pages long, essentially. So I love that as kind of an analogy. Joanna, one of the key things, and sorry, before I go on to that, I want to remind people, this is not the podcast itself. So the full podcast episode link is below in the comments of this event, whether you're watching it live or whether you're watching on the replay. If you are watching live, or even if you're watching on the replay, actually, I would very much welcome your comments. We can see them as they pop up on LinkedIn. So we can see them there and we can respond live to those questions that you have or any comments that you have. If you're watching the replay, then we can just comment directly at LinkedIn afterwards. But one of the things that we talked about is, I suppose, an area of passion of mine is this concept of values and the importance of our values at work and communicating those values. So it's not just one thing to say we have these values. It's about understanding what that means and kind of how it links maybe to the overall business as well.
Yeah, and values is one of those things. When I talk about having a shared understanding, like values is one of those things that everybody in the organization really needs to understand. So you think about the purpose, the mission, the values, they're the kind of golden threads that go across every single employee. Doesn't matter what department you're in, what role you're in. But if you have kind of vague values that maybe aren't explicit, like loads of companies have integrity as a value. So if you actually took 10 random employees and you got them to sit down and say, what does integrity mean? What does it look like? How would you know if a colleague was living integrity? How would you know if they weren't? What would you do about that? I would say you'd get 10 completely different answers.
Yeah.
So part of that bit is, working with senior leaders to say, let's get clearer on this, let's get more explicit about this, and then let's do storytelling about this. The mistake I often see is people will come up with something like a set of core values, they'll do a big launch, and then there's like radio silence for the rest of the year, whereas actually you need to be talking about it all the time in regular, different, interesting ways.
Yeah, you need to remind people what they are. And if I think back to my corporate days, I think we did an okay job on the values in terms of getting an understanding of what they values were. Now, we didn't do a great job of living those values, my personal opinion. Like, they were very far detached from the reality of what was going on a day-to-day basis. But I suppose the other thing that springs to mind in this situation is, like, it can be a very isolated incident and you just do it once and then you kind of don't repeat it throughout. And people get a little bit lost. And if I think back again to my corporate days on the strategy piece, it was a question that often came up in our engagement surveys. And I think most people were a bit confused about the strategy because maybe things changed or they didn't know what was the mission versus what was the strategy. And just knowing the different maybe jargon of the business world of like, well, what is this and what is this and how is that changed and how does that relate to me and my role and what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's important not only for senior leaders, but for that to come through the entire organization and for that communication to happen consistently. And by consistently, I don't mean regularly. I mean that it's the same message that's going to everyone, essentially.
Yeah, and you're touching on something there that's very dear to my heart, which is about there can be confusion sometimes. People think communication is just the distribution of information.
Yes.
That's only one part of it, right? You also need to check for understanding. So a really good internal communicator will spend a lot of time listening and will spend a lot of time with different employees, like one-to-one conversations, focus groups. People get very hung up on surveys, but actually when you just start having conversations with people to find out their understanding of things. I did a focus group recently where I got people to do like a silent brainstorm to write down their ideas of things in a shared document. So I could see it in real time as they're typing away. And it was very clear straight away, there are very different understandings of something that, say, a leadership team might think this is very straightforward, but actually it's being interpreted in multiple different ways. So a good internal communicator will be on top of that. They will understand that. And they will act as kind of the bridge between the employees and the senior leadership team to create that understanding of this is what you're saying, it's being understood this way, let's try something else, let's get alignment here.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And like, I think communication is one of the fundamental things in business. I was going to say, is it a skill? Is it a department? Like, what is it? But it's fundamental to how business operates, essentially, whether that's internal communication and what gets distributed internally or what gets understood internally, and in external communication and how you're perceived by your customers and things like that. And again, going back to my corporate days, if I think this just popped into my head that if I think back of that one organization where I worked, where I'm sure there was an internal communication specific role, did not really know what that meant, but I was on a communications committee. So again, that was for the purposes of distributing that information, probably less so on the listening. So I think that's a really, really important point that you make, that it's not just about the kind of putting the information out there, it's checking for how well have people understood it. I'm one of these data nerds, so I love surveys and looking at comparing results and tracking over time and all of that kind of stuff. I'm less so maybe on the qualitative, but I can see the real importance of that, of just talking to people to check for their understanding of the messages that have been put out there. What are the kind of things that you found in that? Like, that are people picking it up in a different way, and how do you address those issues?
Sometimes you'll find really interesting things that, particularly if you do a survey. So, like if I were reviewing internal communication for a company, I will generally do like a quantitative survey first, so you can get a kind of an overview of kind of the channels that people are using, how they rate the effectiveness of communication, what challenges they have, what's working well, what's not. And then you can take that as a starting point for conversations. So then you can delve into the qualitative stuff. So I remember being in a focus group once, and people were saying, oh, I don't understand about X, Y, and Z. And some of it was around jargon that was used. Some of it was around just the length of, messages that was sent out. But there was one guy who just said, you know what, English is my third language, maybe even my fourth language. I find it really hard to follow along when everything's verbal only. So why is there no written summary of the really important updates? And I was like, and that's such a simple, quick fix, a really simple thing, but you wouldn't necessarily intuitively think of that as someone whose native language is English, unless you go and have those conversations. Yeah. So I just think that whole, and I'm with you, Aoife, I'm a data nerd as well. Like, when you take the time, I have a good friend, Andrew Hubbard, he's the director of communications with Populo, and he has a great phrase. He says, you need to be unapologetic about spending time with your audience. Because it's only then that you'll understand how to improve what you're doing, how to improve understanding, how to make your communications have an impact. Then you can bring that back to the leadership with data and evidence to say, it's not that I feel you are doing the wrong thing, but the data says. I mean, the dispassionate data, you can't argue with that.
Exactly.
So it's a smart way to bring insights to a leadership team.
It's not just my gut feel saying that I think that this is what we should do or this hasn't worked out. You can actually back it up with data, which, total data nerd here as well. I would just want to read out some of the comments that we've got on LinkedIn. So Lola is saying communication is key to a productive and effective teamwork. Absolutely. Elena or Elena, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Communications are generally listed as a number one reason for failed projects, according to corporate surveys. So breakdown of communication always happens. And I love this comment again from Lola. I see that the problem with communication is that people are not able to access those communication skills when they're disconnected emotionally. I love that. Or even when they're feeling high sense of emotion, when the stakes are high, maybe those skills sort of evaporate. They sort of leave us, if we're feeling really high or really strong emotions or something like that. So maybe that's also the case, rather than just disconnected emotionally. Our brain sort of disengages when we become angry or when we feel threatened or whatever that might be. So Joanna, like, we're kind of talking about some of the things that we haven't necessarily covered on the full podcast episode. Like, it was for me, a really enlightening podcast episode. And, people are sharing about it on LinkedIn already. We talked about various different things like communications. We talked about values. We talked about power and the power differentials at work, the role of managers. We talked about flexibility and being more strategic. So prioritization and thinking a bit more strategically rather than tactically. So we covered loads and loads of ground. For anyone who hasn't listened to the full podcast episode, like I said, the full episode is in the link below in the comments. So if you haven't listened to it, check it out. This is not the podcast. I need to remind people all the time. They're like, oh, yeah, I saw you did a podcast again there on LinkedIn. I'm like, this is not the podcast. This is the LinkedIn Live. Podcast is much longer. It's about almost an hour, maybe 50 minutes. But if you use a little trick that I use, I'm listening to my podcast at about 1.5 or 1.75 speed these days, just to get as much as I can from all of my own podcast listening. Joanna, before we wrap things up, anything else that you'd like to share with people, any sort of takeaways or any reasons to direct them to the full episode?
Do you know what? We were talking about getting me on the podcast for ages, and I'm so nervous to do it. You're some woman, you're like, I'm not telling you in advance what we talk about, but just go on and we'll have a chat. And as somebody who like over prepares for everything, that made me very uncomfortable. But I did it anyway. So my message is, if you're really scared of doing something and you know that it's just because you're worried you might look silly or you're not quite there, just do it. Just give it a go. What's the worst that can happen? I think that's where you really grow. I would love for people to listen to the full podcast. Also, have a look at my new newsletter, which is just out, because I'll be sharing weekly tips on communication, really practical stuff. Again, data-driven stuff that you can use to improve communication in your own organization.
I'll be signing up to that newsletter as well. I absolutely love the content that you put out there, Joanna. You're so generous with your information. Now, before we wrap things up, I think just by the skin of her teeth, Katie has got something, question, not to put you on the spot too much. What recommendations, and this may require like a 15-minute answer, I don't know, what recommendations can you provide to employees experiencing disconnection as a result of organizational changes or transitions in order to enhance their communication skills and adapt effectively? Sorry, that was kind of jumping because there were some more things coming.
That's a big one. I think when you're talking about a company that's going through lots of changes, it could be restructures, it could be layoffs, a change of strategy, those bits, like I said earlier, those golden threads that you always come back to around the purpose. So why does the company exist? The mission, what are we trying to achieve together? And the values, which is how do we do that? They are the bits that people can connect to consistently throughout any change or event. And she said something there about communication skills. I always am so baffled by the lack of communication training, just anywhere. I mean, I suppose I'm thinking specifically of people who are promoted to management maybe for a first time, and then the organization is really surprised that they're terrible communicators. I'm like, did you help them with that? Like, it's a skill, you have to learn it and practice it. So going back to those golden threads, and then maybe looking at what offering are you giving to your employees to actually help them with communication skills. Don't assume that everyone is a great communicator, because they're not.
Yeah. And you know what, like, and we're not going to get into this now, but one thing that we didn't really touch on is maybe the different communication styles and all of that kind of thing that can impact people's ability to communicate with one another. And this idea with I said something versus I understood something. So I said one thing on the assumption that other people have the same understanding that I have, but they don't necessarily. And I think it's something, like, I'm not going to say I have all the answers. I think it's something that you know, everyone can continue to learn how to communicate more effectively. What I will say is I love this idea of the golden threads, and it's maybe bringing it back to why are we all here and why is this change happening and what is the outcome that's expected from this change and how do we work collectively to make sure that we achieve that outcome.
Yeah, it's all about that. You know, there's a lot of talk of how do you get people feeling connected now that people are working at home. Sometimes it's not about connecting together as people, but sometimes it's connecting to the organization. And that's going back to the roots of why are we here? Why are we doing this? How do we work together? Okay. And having that line of sight between what I'm doing every day and what the company is trying to achieve at a higher level. If you can get that, that's hard, right? And that takes a lot of work, but it's so powerful if you can get that. That helps people to feel connected.
That's a drum I beat all the time, Joanna. No, like, if someone just knows what the impact that they're having on the organization is. I want to read out a few more comments here as well. So emotional responsiveness is key in helping people feel heard, valued, and not alone. I feel like when changes happen, people have no chance of expressing how they feel, and they often feel alone. And I think in an organizational context, and I have been the recipient of various different changes that have happened in organizations over the years. And you do feel like that. You feel like you have had no active participation in driving what that change is. It's just kind of happening to you as opposed to anything else. So that might be, there's loads of more comments popping up. So I'll kind of go, we can maybe both have a look at them in the comment section afterwards, but mostly to say thank you to both of us. So absolutely no problem. You know, this is something I love doing. And if you haven't listened to the full podcast episode yet, head over and check that out now. Joanna, once again, thank you so much for your time today and for your time on the podcast. And I look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Thanks a million. Bye.